Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a cold, rainy spring day. Quick question. How many of you have ever heard of a Pershing guided missile? A few. General Pershing was the American Army main general in the First World War. And after World War II, suddenly we found ourselves in an arms race with the U.S.S.R. And I'm going to talk for the next 40 minutes with regards to the logistics. I'm an Army veteran, and I served in what was then West Germany, and I've got a map up here we'll key in on in a little while. Back in the Cold War days, a lot of young people probably don't have an idea just what the Cold War was anymore. But let's go back. Up here, this slide, how many of you have ever heard of someone called Wernher von Braun? Okay. Wernher von Braun was the brains behind the German World War II guided missile program. And what you see here is a V-1 rocket. Now, a rocket does not have a guidance system. And these V-1s were launched from northern Germany, mainly into England. And the whole idea was the V stands for Vergeltungswaffe, a vengeance weapon. And the Nazis thought that they could scare the Allies because these buzz bombs, is how they were called, you could hear them and it would frighten the population. You'd hear the buzz and then they'd land and explode. And it was like nothing anybody had ever experienced before. So it was supposed to terrify particularly the English into saying, hey, let's just knock this war off, let's have a truce. And these V-1s, they traveled about 400 miles an hour, which is pretty quick. However, fighter aircraft, propeller jobs could often shoot these down because they went pretty much close to that same speed. Now, in September 1944, they came up what was called the V-2. And the V-2, it was far more sophisticated, it carried a bigger payload, and its speed was about 3,000 miles an hour. That's moving, okay? And what you see today with the North Koreans trying to develop this technology, the Germans already had in 1944 and 1945. And thank the good Lord, mercifully, they did not have these deployed and developed during the D-Day invasion, because it could have caused quite a havoc with our fleet off the coast of France, the invasion fleet. I'll give you some more details about this in a little while. Wernher von Braun, when the war ended, there was a scramble by the Allies to find these German scientists. And we were able to find Wernher von Braun, who was the #1 guy, just hours before the Russians would have gotten him. And thank heavens again that they didn't. The Russians did find a number of their top scientists. And I'll show you a map here, if you can see. Here's Denmark, here's Austria and Switzerland, here's Germany. The distance here is from here to here is about 480 miles, okay? The Germans would launch their missiles from this coastline on in over to Britain, but here is where they had the factories and their developments. Now, those of you who know World War II, the Russians came in and took this section, which became Old East Germany, and this was their sector, and they were moving in here. Americans went over here just quickly and snatched von Braun, and they snatched a number of his top scientists at the same time. Now, we've got this guy. What do we do with him? Top secret. We don't want the Russians to know that we've got him because they're still looking for him. We want to bring him back to the States, but we got to be careful about that too, because our populace might say, why are we bringing Nazi scientists into this country? The war had just ended. So they took him by boat and they brought him to the East Coast. They disguised him and told him, if anybody asks you, because you have a German accent, tell them you're a Swiss businessman. And they got an Army officer intelligence officer in civilian clothes. They put him on a train, and they took him by train with this officer accompanying him to St. Louis. And along the way, supposedly, one inquisitive guy struck up a conversation with him, and Von Braun said, "Oh, I'm a Swiss businessman." And this guy said, "Oh yeah, I'm an American salesman with steel companies, and I've done business in Switzerland." Here it goes, you know. But they were able to deflect this. So from St. Louis, they took him down south to the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, and then eventually to the White Sands missile facilities out in New Mexico. And he then went to work with he and his other German scientists all through the late 40s, and they perfected this V1. And by the early 50s, the United States, because we had atomic weapons, had already perfected artillery shells that were atomic. And the center of this was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and that's where I received my training after basic training. And they developed a cannon called Atomic Annie that could shoot an atomic artillery shell about 15 or 20 miles. Well, quickly, the missiles surpassed that. And in the early 1950s, they came up with a guided missile called the Redstone. Now, it was somewhat sophisticated. It didn't have that great of a distance, 50, maybe 100, 150 miles at most. But the guidance sections were pretty good, but not quite as well perfected. Now, you see on the evening news, the North Koreans are always shooting these things up in the air. Well, when you see one of these come up in the air, what you realize is, or you don't see, is it's coming up like this. When this comes up far enough towards the stratosphere, the bottom booster section drops off and away. The missile then will level out, and then there's another booster section, and that thrust is done and burned out, the fuel's gone. The thing will come up to this kind of configuration and travel just like a regular Army artillery shell. And then right after this front section of this warhead is a guidance section. And that's what von Braun perfected. The North Koreans, thank heaven again, haven't gotten there yet. They shoot them up in the air in an arc, and sometimes it'll land straight here or off in the ocean somewhere. But they don't have the mental wherewithal, they're working on it, to perfect a guidance system that can project this to the other part of the world, or even Hawaii or Guam. And also, the tip of these, because of the great velocity and the heat, you have to have special metals to harden that tip. Because what they have now for re-entry would probably burn up before it landed on Honolulu or Milwaukee. So, just a little technical background on this. Now, Wernher von Braun, they made him American citizen in 1955. And all the missile technology I'll talk to you about in this spyware and so forth, linking into that, comes from his head. We put men on the moon in 1969, the Apollo space program. That's all from him. So thankfully, we got Wernher von Braun instead of the bad guys. Next slide, please. This is Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Fort Sill to this day is the Army's training center for all of its missiles. This is May 1971, and these are the men that I trained with for an entire year, and that's me back a long time ago. May 1971, we trained at Fort Sill for an entire year on this Pershing missile system, everything about it. We cross-trained. What is entailed, these were about 30 feet in height. And initially they were on tracked vehicles, then they put them on trucks. We learned everything about them, how to take them down, put them together, how to calibrate them, how to do fire direction control. So for us, it was a challenge. Most of us had just gotten out of college, and it was a purposeful, useful mission in the Cold War. Now, a lot of you people don't realize the Vietnam War was winding down already about 1970. And the Pentagon had a big worry because, like in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, there was concern with the U.S. being bogged down in fighting in Asia. What happens if the Russians say, what a great time to attack Europe? And that was a concern in the Korean War and all the more so in the Vietnam War. So we knew we were training to go over to Germany because the height of the Vietnam War, the U.S. had 500,000 soldiers there in 1968 and 1969. Unbeknown to most people, at the same time, we had 500,000 Army and Air Force personnel in West Germany. Now, our group, we trained together. We still have reunions, by the way. We just had one here in Milwaukee last fall. So we got along splendidly, and I think the Army picked us for those reasons. We had one or two oddballs, but nothing serious. I myself speak German, so I think that's one of the reasons they may have put me in here. A lot of these guys were mathematicians and engineers and so forth. Next slide. Here is an American Army officer with a West German. Now, take a look at our map. Those of you on the front have a little bit of handicap, but not too bad. Here you see old East Germany. Well, at the end of World War II, the British, they occupied this section. The Americans had all of this down here, and the French had a little quarter here. Here, okay, is Berlin, Hamburg. Here you have the Ruhr, where you have Essen and Dusseldorf and Cologne. Here is Frankfurt. Here's Heidelberg. Here's Munich. Down here's the Alps. Here's the Rhine River. Now, the British is where their section was. They had what they called the British Army on the Rhine, and that was just a short way from where we were stationed. So instead of us being stationed where most of the Americans were, they brought us here to a West German Luftwaffe base that was owned by the British. So we had a partnership of about 100 Americans, roughly 2,000 West Germans, and just a handful of British guys. So our work, what we did, waiting for the war to happen, which thankfully it didn't, we had to always be prepared and ready to fire our missiles. We had 2 of them where we were, but other parts of Germany, there were many more of these Pershing missiles. We had to be able to fire these within a 10-minute notice and warning. And people will ask, why within 10 minutes? Because that's just about the distance that Russian aircraft could fly and hit us and destroy us before we could get them off the ground. And I'll tell you about one maneuver we had one time that we thought we were going to war. Northern Germany, as you look at it here, is flat. How many of you have been to Germany? Okay, it's flat. It's kind of like Iowa, Illinois, some areas, Indiana. Down here in the middle, it's kind of like what we have our Ozarks or Appalachians. And down in southern Germany, you have the mountainous, like the Rocky Mountains, the Alps. Now, the way NATO looked at it is, what if the Russians were to quickly just say, let's just invade Western Europe. We can occupy, we're this close, we can hit Hamburg, we can take Frankfurt, the Ruhr, we can go into Brussels, Paris. They figured, realize this, we had 500,000 men, the British 50,000, the West Germans about 300,000. The Russians had millions of men, millions. We had about 10,000 tanks. Many of them were in Vietnam, many were in South Korea or stateside. The rest of them we had in West Germany. The Russians had 50,000. They had more aircraft than we had. So a conventional war, they were numerically superior. And we had in West Berlin 10,000 soldiers. And they were told you would have a life expectancy of about 10, 12, maybe 15 hours. Basically a speed bump. So the Army then, in the 1960s, deployed these Pershing missiles in West Germany as a deterrent. We would immediately go nuclear as a deterrent to keep the Russians from capturing all of Western Europe. Now, this area here is flat. It's perfect tank country, where the Russians would fan out this way, probably head to the North Sea, take Hamburg. So the British Army up here would have to stop them, or Army with our missiles, the Navy with their Polaris missiles, or the Air Force with their bombers would have to lay down a nuclear carpet here to stop them and destroy them. In the middle of Germany is something called the Fulda Gap. And this was a traditional invasion route, the time of Napoleon, going back to probably the days of Caesar. And in this topography here, like our Appalachians or Ozarks, there's a gap here that is a traditional invasion route where an enemy force could quickly funnel in and take Frankfurt quickly. And we had a big headquarters in Frankfurt, and the 7th Army was in Heidelberg. So, more than likely, I don't know, it was beyond my pay grade, we probably had the Fulda Gap targeted. I've talked to Air Force veterans, and they said, yes, we practiced to stop Russian tanks in the Fulda Gap. So that is pretty much the backdrop of what was being faced by NATO at that time. And it was a real concern. During the Korean War, when the United States and NATO stopped the North Koreans and pushed them back up past the Yalu River, anybody know what happened? The Chinese entered the war. Okay? So we have had a lot of men in Korea. We still do to this day. And the great concern is anytime you're facing off with these third world countries, they got a lot of people. And it was nothing in the Korean War for the Koreans to flood North Korea with 200,000 men. And in North Korea, we had the 15,000 Marines and about 2,000 soldiers right up there to that border, and they had to basically hightail it out. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. So always a concern. Think of this. They've got a lot of people, and they have their armor. A lot of it is obsolete, but numerically, that's why we had to have nuclear weapons over there. And let's do the next slide, and we'll continue on. This is a Pershing without the warhead on there, and this is a West German vehicle. Here is our base. Here's a West German soldier at our gate. There's a little canteen, and here they had a V-1 rocket here to just kind of show people as a memorial. But once again, these were mobile, and the advantage to having a mobile missile is if they know where you're at, they can target you. But if you pick it up and move it 10 miles away, they don't know where you're going. Are they going to go north, south, east, west? And if they find out by the time they calibrate their missiles or jets, you move somewhere else. Now, when we trained at Fort Sill, they taught us defensive infantry tactics. I guess I ought to ask, any soldiers or Marines in here? Okay, a few of you. When these missiles are moved, you have one part of the crew will take it off of its status of being moved and set it up to be able to launch and fire in short order. And the rest of the guys go out, fan out in a circular perimeter, and this perimeter around, maybe we would set it up 200 meters, 300 meters out, and dig foxholes, and you'd have probably about 50 meters between one foxhole to the other. And so in a defensive position, 24/7, January or July, rain, snow, or whatever, you are here to defend anybody who would come in. And there's always a concern about saboteurs to come in and steal one of these things or just blow it up. So what we would do, we would set up our machine guns, and the common thing is, well, you point it out this way. No. You point your machine gun to cover the foxhole next to you, and he covers you in front. So you have an interlocking fire where nobody can come through. You can spray a whole area, and you keep doing this kind of thing back and forth where nobody could get on through. Claymore mines could be set out, and we'd have heavy M60 machine guns. We carried M16 rifles. Our officers and NCOs had 45 caliber sidearms. So all throughout the late 60s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, you had all over West Germany, you had some of them were stationary, others were moving about all the time, ready to fire. when the Pentagon would let Heidelberg, where the headquarters was over there, know, we always were ready to go to war as a defense against a Soviet invasion of West Germany. Next slide. Here you see some West Germans. Here's a couple of their NCOs and officers. And here you see some West German soldiers with their machine guns. And they would be in the field, sometimes with us, sometimes without us. And they were pretty good troops, in my opinion. They were glad that we were there. Some of them, of course, were not, but by and large, they would rather have the Americans there than the Russians in West Germany. I would say their attitude was pretty good. They trained well, they were good soldiers, and the entire time over there, though, where you had missiles stored, you'd have some Americans there, and then around you'd have a barbed wire perimeter with Germans with their German Shepherd guard dogs always walking around out there. Because once again, this is out in the woods, it's dark, and what a perfect place for somebody to come in and blow one of these things up. And it would be an international incident. And if something like that did happen, I didn't find out about it, and they certainly, Pentagon wouldn't let the TV networks know about it either. But that was always a concern, providing security. So let's move on. Next slide. Here's General Pershing. As I mentioned in the very beginning, he was the American general in the First World War. Here I am, and here's one of our Pershings at ready fire status. And like I said, this, I'm going to step down just a little bit further. Here you can see, here's the warhead, here's the guidance section, here is the booster section, here is the main propellant. And here you have all the brains behind it, the electricity going on, the generators and so on. It's in a fire position now. When it's not ready to fire, it's down once again in this horizontal configuration to be moved or just be ready. But when there's a status to fire it quickly, everybody goes into work, and once again, we used to have these drills where we would practice to be ready to fire them in 10 minutes. Now, somebody one time asked me, well, Ken, what were your instructions after you fired them? And the joke was always, officially, well, you join the infantry and you fight as infantrymen. But we always knew that the bad guys had something on the way, and the joke was, you bend over, kiss your posterity goodbye. Because more than likely, if their missiles or jets didn't get there before we did, they would be there shortly thereafter. And that's the ugly reality of what could have been World War III. And mercifully, that never happened. But we're not out of the woods yet. We're still dealing with Iran. We're still dealing with North Korea. But there's an association of Pershing veterans, and the title given was, We Kept the Peace. Because when Ronald Reagan became president, I'll tell you in a minute what he did. Let's move on to the next slide. And I ought to mention, it's called a battery. Those of you who are armed forces veterans, in the Army, a company is called of soldiers in the infantry is called a company of about 100 men. Tanks, armor, it's also called a company. You get then to the cavalry, it's called a troop. In the artillery, it's called a battery, probably from medieval days where you had battering rams and so forth like that. So an artillery group is a battery. And how am I doing on time here?
About 20 minutes.
Okay, plenty of time. Probably a lot of you don't know this. Just a quick segue. The lowest unit in the military, in the Army or the Marines, is called a squad. Squad's about 10 or 11 men. And that's a sergeant who is a commanding guy over that. 4 squads make up a platoon. A platoon has a lieutenant over it. Okay, that's the next configuration. Then 3 or 4 of those platoons make up a company, and that's usually a captain over that. Then 3 or 4 of those make up what's called a battalion. And the head of a battalion is usually an Army or Marine Corps major or lieutenant colonel. Then as is growing, the next up from that is called a brigade. And a brigade is composed of 3 or 4 battalions. And over that you have a full bird colonel or a general, 1-star general called a brigadier general. Let's keep climbing. Then we have 3 or 4 of these brigades which will compose an Army division. And a division is about 12 to 15,000 soldiers that you have. Then beyond that you have something called an army. And an army will be composed of about 3 or 4 divisions. Over in Germany, in Heidelberg, it was the 7th Army. And I had one of the patches here. I left it behind. I'll just briefly mention that to you. What we've got here is a Pershing II. Now, the Pershing II was the Pershing I on steroids. Here, Ronald Reagan didn't play games. He told the Russians, we basically are going to outdo you. We're not playing games anymore. The Pershing I had a range of about 400 miles. That could hit all of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Well, they ramped this Pershing II up to greater speed, greater payload. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had 20,000 kilotons. The one on Nagasaki was about 14,000, 15,000 kilotons. That's tons of TNT. The Pershing I had about, I'd say, the same as the Nagasaki. And if that landed right down here in downtown Milwaukee, everything probably within about a square mile, all metals would be melted, most people would be killed. 2 and 3 miles out, fires, secondary fires would be lit. People out and exposed would probably suffer various degrees of burns and so forth. So these Pershing I's were aimed at hitting Russian armor troops, maybe submarine pens that they had somewhere. But the Pershing II now ramped up, bigger warhead, greater payload, more accurate guidance section, and it was said that they could hit the men's room in the Kremlin with this. That scared the Russians because the Air Force in the silos here in this country, they have what's called ICBMs. You've heard of that. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they are called strategic. But problem is, it's a long way from Montana to Moscow. It takes a little while to get there. The Army has field artillery guided missiles. They're closer into where the enemy is, can get there faster, and they are called tactical nuclear weapons. So these being close to the Kremlin would get there like real quick, and it scared the Russians enough where they basically agreed with Reagan to do the SALT II treaties. Now, there was a lot of protests in West Germany at that time, in France, England, among pacifistic groups. It's like, don't deploy these over here. You're going to cause World War III. Well, it didn't cause World War III. It ended the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan is to be saluted for that. Whether you agree with him politically, one way or the other, left to right, up or down, he was wise in dealing with Gorbachev. Gorbachev realized the threat, and economically, the U.S.S.R. did not have the money to put anything on the map equal to what this was. So that was the Pershing II. In the late 1980s, these were decommissioned. So we signed this SALT agreement with the Russians. They would get rid of their stuff. We would get rid of our stuff. Plus, at that same time, cruise missile technology came in and made these obsolete. So everything you're looking at here, this is like out of a museum. You can go to museums at Fort Sill to see them. They served their purpose. They kept the peace. But they're now decommissioned and obsolete. They were all brought back to Redstone Arsenal in 1988, 89, and scrapped out. Next slide. Here you see missiles in the European theater. Here you see all the Russian hardware. And once again, they had a lot more stuff than we did. It wasn't as accurate by any means, and it wasn't as reliable. But numerically, they had a lot more. Next slide. Warsaw Pact versus NATO. Mercifully, that never happened. Not to say, it seems like in many ways we're not getting along very well with the Russians these days, and hopefully that can be defused, because Who wants World War III? None of us here, certainly. Next slide. Battlefield Europe. Here you see a small missile being launched from an Army tank. Is part of a deterrent on the ground. One more slide.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. Now, let me tell you some interesting stories. You can't see it from here. When we got over there to Germany, the British gave us these, and you can't see it, but it's a Soviet flag, and it's about a little note from the British Army. If you see any license plate on a car, it's with a Russian Soviet flag on there, it's probably from their embassy snooping around to see what they can learn about what you guys are and what you are doing. We were warned, when you're in town, watch what you're saying and who you're saying with. Because when the Persians first arrived there in that little town, supposedly the Russians broke in on one of their armed forces networks and said, "Welcome to Geilenkirchen, Germany, 85th Artillery," just to let us know that they knew we were there and what we had. I want to salute Richard Nixon, who doesn't get much credit these days, but the biggest alert we had when I was there was in May 1972. And the officers looked worried. Everybody was scrambling around. All these codes were coming down from the Pentagon and to Heidelberg to arm our missiles, to set them up ready to fire. We didn't know what the world was going on all night long. And we didn't find out until the next morning. What had happened is Richard Nixon ordered the U.S. Navy to mine Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam. Haiphong is where the North Vietnamese were getting all of their supplies in from the Russians and Chinese. And the Chinese and Russians said to the U.S., if you ever bomb Haiphong Harbor and hit one of our ships and kill any of our people, if you think you got problems now, you may see us enter the war. So they were afraid to ever bomb this Haiphong Harbor. Well, Nixon said, golly, why don't we do this? Let's just seal the thing off. And because he ordered the Navy to do that, the war ended a year later, by the way. We were put on high alert and status, not knowing just what the Russians might do or how they might react. We're going to have a question and answer period here in a bit, but I'm going to tell you one of my adventures. Let me just look here to see. Our time is running out. I think I've covered pretty much everything. Oh, one comment here. Albert Speer, who was the director of the German war effort for their materials and so forth, he, at the end of the war, was in prison. But he wrote a book later when he got out of jail, and he said, I think we made a mistake. We thought we could intimidate the Allies into frightening them with these missiles. It didn't work. He said, 2020 hindsight, we should have just not done this and put all our money into building more jet aircraft to stop the Allies bombing. And all these young guys were training to be missile crewmen and so on. We could have just trained them to be pilots. A little sidebar. Well, the duty I had was quite good. We'd be on 3 days, off 3 days, and around the night, I turn in my rifle, take off my uniform, and I drove to Cologne, Germany. I hadn't been there. This was the merry month of May. And I had a little car, had a girlfriend over there and everything. It was pretty nice duty. And I got back to the post around noon. It was a perfect day in spring that we're waiting to get here one of these days. And I said, I'm going to take a walk. So I went out into the woods taking a walk. Beautiful day, having a great time. And I get up to a little rise. And off in the distance, I could see where our missiles were sitting, maybe about three-quarters of a mile away. Interesting. And do you ever get the feeling somehow you're not alone? And I looked, and maybe about from here to where the man is over there, I see, dressed in a black leather jacket, a middle-aged man with a pair of binoculars looking down to where our missiles were. And when things like this happen, your mind races at Mach speed. And before I could react or say anything, he sensed that he wasn't alone. He looked over at me, as startled as I was, dropped his binoculars, and he said in German, ich bin hier Vogelbeobachter, I'm a bird watcher. And I said, ja, bin ich auch, yeah, me too, I'm a bird watcher. And he was as startled as I was. And I'm thinking, should I rush and tackle this guy and be a hero? Or, in this split seconds, who is this guy? Who was he? Obviously, he's some kind of agent from the East Bloc. Was he a Gestapo or officer or anybody in World War II? Is he a Russian spy? West German? East German? No idea. And I bet before I can get that distance, he's got something called a knife in his belt or a gun. And I didn't want to think of my young 23-year-old bones rotting in some forest in Germany. So he goes this way, I go this way back to the post. And I run down into the officer of the day and I tell him what I just saw. He gets on his phone, rings it up. And 3 minutes later, a Jeep full of German soldiers, about a driver, 2 or 3 guys with rifles. I get in there with them in the front, and we drive right to that place, and obviously the guy's not going to be there anymore. But to this day, I wonder who he was and what he thought of the whole thing. If he told his boss or kept his mouth shut, who knows what his orders were. If you're found out, kill anybody that finds you, or I don't know. Time for questions and answers. Anybody out here? Raise your hand and stand if you got a question on any of this. One, yes.
I heard something about the possibility of missiles in cargo containers that could possibly be coming into the U.S. and Russian owned ports, things like that. Can you comment on what possibly that would be?
Yeah, that's always a concern that somebody would take a missile and put it on a barge off of the coast of New York or whatever. A lot of these containers, you don't know what's coming in. You only can inspect so many of them. And I don't know if it would be better to just launch some kind of crude missile, or just have like a ticking time bomb kind of, if I was a bad guy, North Koreans or Iranians, I would just get a low-level nuclear bomb and just set it out there and have it go off a day after, rather than doing a missile. That's beyond my pay grade, but you hear some of these stories once in a while, conceivably, and they could launch this with an EMP attack. You've heard about that, to fry all of our computers and things. And I'm sure the Pentagon is well aware of that possibility. Anybody have any insight into that or thoughts? Anybody else? Question? Well, I thank you for listening to me. The Cold War is history. If you are ever down in southwest Oklahoma, between Oklahoma City and the Texas line, Fort Sill has a museum there. And it's open to the public. It's quite interesting. They have all the things on Von Braun there. They have all these old missiles from the way back in days. And you could spend a full day there looking at any of the things. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your service, sir.
Glad to serve our country. And thank you, other Armed Forces veterans as well. Stay warm. Enjoy the rest of the convention. And enjoy the weekend. Thank you for having me.